So a new person in the job. Yes. Oh, yeah. American history. Well, the reason we're doing this issue, this is a vote for history. This is a vote for the liberal arts. I know we're and he understands believes so strongly in and say, oh, that's not a useful page. It's not a useful thing.
So you can put yourself anywhere.
No, you're late. Well, it's a blessing for all of us that you're here because you're right.
He's one of us.
I love the little arts. Yeah, house. We're open.
Oh, even the social. Oh, we get everything.
Okay.
Come on, Lydia.
Yeah, that's right. That's why I've never considered that.
Watch your slides.
Birthday present.
Figure out.
Yeah, I always recommend how are we doing? Good. How's Sammy like? How's everyone? Oh no, at school or? Oh, Nate, he was like.
They look perfect, don't they? I mean, that's always ends up in the happiest world.
I saw them on their way, and he looked totally full of fun. He was ready for the day.
It was
Yeah, exactly. Right. Good luck.
Yeah.
great.
You were in Helsinki. You got everything back.
Okay, so you want to connect. This 5 minute answer check is not essential, but I can like, so we have to connect here. So I think there's a multi-tool. I mean, I can also send a link. Like I have it down. That might be easier, but I could send. So I've got this one on Google Slides that just needs to be projected.
Yeah.
So having the opportunity for
Yeah, nobody was
hiring someone.
That's right.
How was your semester going, Corey?
Oh, lots of
I was so I would never do it again. Whenever I get a chance, I get a higher level. Yeah.
I hope you have fun here. Enjoy it. Where do you live?
I live in Riverdale.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Riverdale's lovely.
Yeah, we love it. So it might be easier. I'm just going to move here. Okay. I wonder what would happen. So do you have a port? You have a mic port. If we switch from this, and what kind of port do you have? You have that, you have this one, right? Yep.
Another example of this, what you said.
So let's see if that actually connects.
He had a time on it. He insisted on I invite him to have
It's not.
a baseball game. And this was like
It's fish.
150.
So there's a.
That sort of thing. Yeah.
Oh,
like,
it's like
same
it's just a
thing, you know.
background.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so.
Some tech guy explained to me that there's a reason it's like that. Like connect it like as a kind of privacy thing. And like,
Oh. So what happens if you click on the video? Maybe it'd be better to click on YouTube. Wait, hold on. Let's try this. So what's the address here? Okay. Hashtag.
But they're basically they're like going to sleep basically. What they're doing. It's like, whoa.
Oh, I cannot type.
Oh yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah, that's
A little like bugs, yeah.
we worked it out. Now,
That's right. That's right.
what
That's
did they
right.
use?
Oh really?
So Marci, oh, sorry.
No. Wow.
So Marci, I'm just going to show you. So I'm going to have this projected, and then when you're ready, you just hit escape, click, and then hit play.
okay.
Right.
Sound is
Oh,
too.
sure. It sounded like it was coming.
Was
through.
it?
There's music in this one.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because they.
All the students are mine, like 30 of the students.
Several are maybe they overlap.
Yeah, so it's.
Oh,
Thank you.
hey. That's right. Where's my bicycle? My bicycle. Whatever it takes.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. I bet you did. That's great. That's so cool. Yeah, a gift from above. Yes, yeah, that's fine. Oh, yes. There you go. Yeah, yeah. Right. You want to get your doggy things and start finding things in, but you didn't move it just when you liked to. It's true.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Hi, Marci. Oh, it is a delight to meet you. I read your bio. You are extraordinary. This is a privilege. Jack and I.
The husband. Very nice to meet you, Marci.
And we lived for 8 years in Prague and went every week to Vienna. We have so many friends there. But when we saw your connection to Central Europe, and you even speak Polish.
Oh, Rita.
I'm not the
Okay. Very nice to see you again. I love your three-piece suit.
Hi, great to see you. Pleasure. Yeah, pleasure. You turn up your phone. So let's make sure it's
Good afternoon. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I am quasi good with microphones, better without them, but we'll see how we do. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Corey Blatt. I'm the Dean of the School of Liberal Arts. This afternoon we celebrate the 20th annual Brother Casimir Gabriel Costello Lecture and the awarding of the 10th annual award for excellence in teaching. Whoever was in charge of the decennial organization really knew what they were doing. So congratulations to whoever that was. The Brother Casimir Gabriel Costello FSC Award for Excellence in Teaching recognizes a faculty member of the School of Liberal Arts who exemplifies the excellence in teaching that characterizes Manhattan College and is central to its mission and that of the Lasallian Christian Brothers. The award is named in memory of Brother Casimir Gabriel Costello, a Manhattan College graduate who chaired the Department of History for many years and served as the dean of the college from 1953 to 1959. His book, The Arches of the Years, traces the history of Manhattan College from its founding until 1979. This award is made possible through the generosity of Patricia and Jack Stack, representing the Costello family, who have graciously supported this lecture series as well as the Department of History for the past 10 years. As mentioned, this is the 10th year of the Costello Award for Excellence in Teaching, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing this year's recipient, who epitomizes the whole person education that defines Lasallian teaching. The winner of the 2022 award is an accomplished member of the Department of Communication. A scholar of intercultural communication and integrated marketing, her work transcends human and spatial boundaries in the interest of sincere collaboration. Her approach to scholarship and teaching is organically aligned with the Lasallian mission of Manhattan College. This dedication to service is embedded in all aspects of her work. Students in her courses regularly take on projects that serve the needs of the campus as well as local community groups. This bridge between academic and practical application is reflective of her holistic approach to education. In the words of her chair, excuse me, sorry, there's a missing word there. Quote, as a mentor to students, she nurtures their learning and performs the work necessary that sets the path for them to excel. Dr. Anwar does not play favorites and welcomes everyone who wants to learn. She values each student experience and personal growth. My impression is reinforced by the countless students who have publicly thanked Dr. Anwar for her help in their success. One such student echoes this sentiment. Quote, Dr. Anwar is truly the most caring and motivating professor I've ever had. Regardless of whether she's in or out of the classroom, she's always there to help her students with classwork, internships, or life in general. She's not only a great professor, but a great mentor. She makes all of her students feel seen and encourages us to strive for greatness. I'm extremely thankful to be her student, but even more so just to know her. I know I speak for many when I say we are similarly thankful. Please join me in congratulating the 2022 Costello Award for Excellence in Teaching winner, Dr. Ashia Anwar. I would now like to present the Chair of History, Dr. Jennifer Edwards, who will, for the final time, as the Chair of History, that was her, by the way, introduce today's honored speaker, Dr. Marci Shore of Yale University.
Hobbit-sized people. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Edwards, and I'm chair of the History Department for one more year. I would also like to welcome you to the 20th annual lecture in a series honoring the memory of Brother Casimir Gabriel Costello. Although I never had the opportunity to meet Brother Gabriel, who is affectionately known as Cas Gabe, the warm memories shared by his students, colleagues, and family long ago convinced me how much I have missed. Before going further, I want to recognize those who did know him, who have joined us today. First, members of his family. I always want you to stand to be recognized. Woohoo! And then his former students and his former colleagues. I also want to take a moment today to acknowledge one of Brother Gabriel's colleagues who is not with us today, Dr. George Kirsch, longtime chair of the history department, a fellow New Jersey son who passed away this spring. Dr. Kirsch also had a major impact on the college, including through his teaching and his writing, and through the scholarship, the George B. and Susan Kirsch Scholarship he founded for students. When I first began introducing this lecture series, I spent some time in the archives connecting with Brother Gabriel through his papers. I learned a great deal about him. He was born in 1910 in Jersey City, New Jersey, to Irish immigrants and raised in Manhattan and Brooklyn by his mother after the early loss of his father. Brother Gabriel knew his vocation for the church and for history already during his school days at Holy Name. At 14, he left home to join the Christian Brothers, and only 5 years later started teaching. His first teaching assignments were at St. Columba's and La Salle Academy in New York City, from which he traveled to Manhattan College to continue his education, to swim and to play basketball, a trinity that he marked out with fondness for all. Before he was 30, he started a career teaching college at the Staten Island division of Manhattan College, a branch campus that did not survive World War II, and studied for his PhD at Fordham University. In 1949, a few months before his 40th birthday, he came to Manhattan College to serve as head of the history department, where he taught modern European history. During his career, he was dean of the college and a delegate to the 39th General Chapter in Rome. He oversaw the split between the history and government departments, now political science. And as he noted in the spring 1978 registration announcement, he graduated at McCotter, the first woman history major graduating from Manhattan College. I know this because he used the back of some extra copies of that announcement to edit his autobiography, classic professor move, which is now housed in our archives. As dean of the college, Kaz Gabe stressed that Manhattan College must offer a liberal education to all of its students, no matter what their area of concentration. As he once wrote, quote, "The college exists primarily for the cultivation of intellectual virtues, and these can never yield primacy to either the functional or the vocational." In this spirit, Brother Gabriel defended academic freedom, most notably during the dark days of the McCarthy era. Following the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 65, much of his energy and time went into adapting its teachings to the life and organization of the brothers here on campus, in the province, and around the world. He respected tradition, but also believed that it should provide a starting point for progress. In that vein, he supported the Pacem in Terris Institute at the college, known today as the Peace and Justice Studies program. He built up the history department by hiring young and talented lay historians, such as Emeritus Professor Frederick Schweitzer, who might ensure the Lasallian pedagogical tradition at Manhattan College. It is no accident that this proud Christian brother dedicated his account of the college's centennial, quote, to the lay faculty of 10 decades whose Christian and scholarly attainments have brilliantly illuminated the pages of Manhattan's history. In every field of endeavor, and until his death in 1992, Brother Gabriel represented the finest traditions of Manhattan College and of the Christian Brothers. This year's event is a special one, as the 20th lecture in the series founded in Brother Gabriel's honor. In 2001, former chair of the history department, Professor Emerita Claire Nolte, worked with alumnus Roger Goebel to design a series in European history to honor Brother Gabriel. Roger Goebel was one of Brother Gabriel's many grateful students. He graduated from Manhattan College with a degree in history as valedictorian in 1957, and he became professor of law at Fordham University and the creator and director of the Center on European Union Law. Professors Nolte and Goebel planned to begin the series in 2001, but 9/11 postponed that initial event. In 2002, the first lecture was delivered by Robert Darnton, whose famous article on the Great Caste Massacre I had only just read in graduate school, just for context. Subsequent events were organized by Dr. Nolte, then by former chair Jeff Horn, and finally, I've had that pleasure. The lectures that have followed that first event over the last 20 years have brought some of the most exciting scholars working in European history to campus to share their work and join our community. Inspired by his teacher, Brother Gabriel, Professor Goebel in turn inspired generations of students himself in his own classes and through this series. We miss both of these admirable men, but know they are with us today in spirit. Since Professor Goebel's passing in 2018, we have been fortunate that Brother Gabriel's niece and nephew, Patricia and Jack Stack, have generously continued this lecture series, in addition to funding the Costello Award for Excellence in Teaching. They have also broadened the series' focus from only Europe to any area of history with relevance, significance, and resonance for our community in honor of Brother Gabriel's passion for all of history. I know that conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Stack has been the highlight of my fall for the past 15 years, and that they keep the spirit of Brother Gabriel alive on campus for all of us. Their generous gifts have honored Brother Gabriel's memory, both through celebrations and stimulating lectures like our program today, and through keeping intellectual curiosity and inspiring teaching at the core of our school identity. Oh, and let's take a moment to this. Congratulations to Dr. Anwar, and also to remember all of the inspiring teachers we have celebrated over the past 10 years. It is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marci Shore. Dr. Shore is Associate Professor of History at Yale University and a regular visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Professor Shore received her BA and PhD from Stanford and her MA at the University of Toronto. She is the award-winning author of 3 books, Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 68, The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, which have all been translated into multiple languages. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship for her current project about phenomenology in East Central Europe, tentatively titled Eyeglasses Floating in the Sky, Central European Encounters that Took Place While Searching for Truth. A skilled and decorated scholar and translator, Professor Shore also writes for public audiences in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and the New York Times. Since the Stacks have charged us with selecting engaging speakers, I'll admit that I fell into a bit of a rabbit hole watching video presentations of Professor Shore speaking about her work because of her talent for making history engaging, immediate, and relevant. I really did just keep clicking and clicking and clicking. Wonderful lectures online that you can explore as well. I'm excited to have a front row seat for the live show today. Dr. Shore's presentation is titled Parting with the End of History, Ukraine, Europe, Revolution, Responsibility. Please welcome Professor Marci Shore.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Jen. Thank you to my colleagues for inviting me. I'll just pick this up. Let me say, first of all, I've been losing my voice a little bit. I have a post-COVID cough, but I promise I'm not infectious. I've been testing negative for 3 weeks, and I tested negative right before I came here. So just to reassure everybody, I'm going to try not to lose my voice while I'm talking to you. I'm going to talk a little bit more softly than I otherwise would. I'm very happy to be here. I'm feeling much more cheerful than I was a few days ago because the news from the place I'm going to talk to you about has been more hopeful in the past few days. Let me first say before I start, because Jen mentioned something about history and engagement. So let me say, normally I write about people who are dead. Normally I work on the 20th century. I don't normally write about things in real time. For the past 6 months, I've done little else than write about Ukraine in real time, under the exigency of the situation. And while I'm not Ukrainian, and the languages I speak there, I speak with a bad accent and clearly as a foreigner, I'm also not a neutral observer. I think many of my colleagues, if not all of my colleagues here, will understand very well that when you work on a part of the world that is not your own, you become attached to it. You become attached to it even if you don't necessarily share anything racial or ethnic or religious or anything else. And these are my friends and colleagues and the friends and colleagues of my friends and colleagues who are being shelled and slaughtered. And I don't have, an objective distance in that sense. I've been watching 24 hours a day, and trying to help them the best I can, and trying in this, at the moment, most of all, to play the role of the bridge, to play the role of the cultural mediator, to play the role of the translator, to be the person who can hopefully help people on the other side of the world, who don't know these people in these places, and make these people in these places feel more real to them. So that's what I've been doing for the past 6 months. And I'm happy to see so many students and young people here. I'm going to try to tell you a bit about Ukraine. And I'm hoping that, 40 minutes from now, it will feel more real to you. I'm going to try to help you make this kind of imaginative leap. So let me take you back to 1989, when the students here were not yet born, but I was 17. That was the moment of the fall of communism. I was a senior in high school. It was the moment that brought me to Eastern Europe. People say, how did you get involved in this field of study? It's a generational story. I was at an impressionable age in 1989. Yesterday, I was teaching phenomenology of spirit to my students at Yale, and I was saying, pay attention to Hegel's birth date. Hegel was born in 1770. He was 19 years old when the French Revolution came. Things you experience when you're 19 years old hit you in a different way from things you experience in your 30s or 40s or 50s. It's a coming of age moment in a different way. So I was 17 in 1989. I was wrapped up in the philosophy of the dissidents and the heroes of the revolution. I was reading a lot of Václav Havel and Paul Wilson's beautiful translation. I was completely caught up in this notion of living in truth. What does it mean to live in truth? Truth was the first word that I learned in Czech, which was my first Slavic language, the first Slavic language I learned. And I was struck by how Czech philosophers used it as if it were like as real as a pen. You could like hold it and put it in your pocket as if it really meant something. No one I had ever known in America had used the word truth that way, with that kind of weight. And just after I turned 18, Václav Havel, who had been an imprisoned dissident playwright and human rights activist, and became then the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia, came to Washington in February 1990 to deliver his first speech to a joint meeting of both houses of Congress, as the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia. And he said there, consciousness precedes being, and not the other way around, as the Marxists claim. Now, presumably nobody actually understood what he meant. I mean, the chances that there were many people in either the Senate or the House of Representatives who remember that moment in Marx and Engels' German ideology, where they talk about how being precedes consciousness, is highly unlikely. But one of the American journalists said, like, wow, if I could talk like that, I would run for God. And that was this language of metaphysics that captured me. To me, Eastern Europe was a language of metaphysics. Ironically, the moment when I went there with the fall of communism in the early 1990s was precisely when that language was disappearing. What replaced it was a discourse of the end of history. And for those of you who don't remember, the end of history was something that the political scientist Francis Fukuyama kind of declared in 1989, which is that the evolution of political ideologies and ideas and alternatives has now reached its end. Now we know that liberal democracy has been victorious. Some of us may have been a little slower getting there, some of us may have been a little faster, but basically we're all on this kind of liberal teleology of progress, and we're all going to live happily ever after, and communism as the last great alternative has now been destroyed. Out of that also comes this notion of TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative, a certain kind of smug satisfaction, and also an idea that liberalism as a political philosophy, democracy as a means of government, and free market neoliberalism as an economic ideology all kind of unproblematically, smoothly went together as part of a harmonious package. Neoliberalism, replaced existentialist metaphysics. Sadly for me, but practically for other people. And there was this sense of what Adam Mitnick called the utopian capitalist package. We were all going to live happily ever after, and the West was going to teach former communist Eastern Europe, how they could, nicely get to liberal democracy. Now, this was something that had a lot of holding power on both sides of the former Iron Curtain. I felt like I was, as a student then, I was not asking questions about, well, maybe there are actually a lot of tensions between liberalism, democracy, and the free market. Maybe those things aren't so unproblematically, going together. But intellectuals in Eastern Europe, including former dissidents who had been reading existentialist metaphysics and writing existentialist metaphysics, also felt like, okay, now the West has shown us the way. At the same time, that transition to a free market was often very brutal. When I first was hanging around in Eastern Europe, it was I felt like, wow, this is like robber baron capitalism. This is like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This is like capitalism has no rules and everyone can exploit you as much as possible and there's no accountability. And especially in former Soviet states, even more so than places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, there was a kind of brutality and wildness in the 1990s. And now I'm going to kind of take you into Ukraine and Russia and that former Soviet space. Because one of the things to keep in mind, and one of the things that's crucial to understanding Russia today, is the trauma of the 1990s. In America, we thought the 1990s was like a big party, like, the Wicked Witch is dead. We're all going to live happily ever after. Okay, there might be some rough spots getting there, but we'll get over them. From the point of view of people there, the ground was just torn under their feet, and suddenly there were radical discrepancies in wealth. People had been living their whole lives according to one set of rules, and suddenly all the rules changed. You had to account for decisions. You didn't necessarily have any way of making it, in a draconian capitalist economy, especially if you were older, especially if you were on a pension. The age at which you were in 1989 was huge. Okay, so while we had this smug liberal triumphalism in the 1990s, it was pretty brutal in Ukraine, which got kind of handed its independence in 1990s. So for the benefit of the students who haven't necessarily been immersed in Soviet history yet, hopefully you all will be at some point, the Soviet Union was arguably the largest scale and most far-reaching social engineering experiment ever performed on mankind. In some ways, we still have to grapple with the scale of the experiment and the scale of the failure. It was a huge territory comprised of 15 constituent republics. It seemingly was going to last forever until the moment when it fell. There was a sense of everything was forever until suddenly it was over in a way that nobody was particularly prepared for. Some places like the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, which had only been part of the Soviet Union since the Second World War, were more eager and ready for independence. Other places less so, like Belarus. Ukraine was handed its independence kind of by default. They didn't have to fight for it. The person who came to power then, his name was Leonid Kravchuk. He was a former Communist Party apparatchik. So basically you have the same kind of elites who are in power, except they're transforming themselves or metamorphosing themselves from communist into capitalist. And there's a kind of robber baron capitalism going on and a kind of descent into kleptocratic oligarchy where the people who had positions in the Communist Party are, not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia and in many post-Soviet places in a particularly good position to steal and monopolize the resources as the economy transitioned. So basically through the 1990s, Ukraine was kind of mired in kleptocratic oligarchy, in corruption scandals, in people not having power or water, in desperate poverty, in industries collapsing. And that was called by my friend and colleague, the Volodya Kulik, the political scientist, the blackmail state. Everything was there was bribery to get anywhere, to do anything. All of the people in education seemed to have plagiarized things or taken bribes from their students or taken bribes from the parents of their students. And that kind of languished through the 1990s until Leonid Kuchma, who is Kravchuk's successor, who had entered politics just in the post-communist era and was mired in corruption scandals. Finally, he was out of there. And in 2004, there was an election between two victors, Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. And the very short version of that story was that Viktor Yanukovych was your kind of post-Soviet gangster type who was coming from this far eastern region of Ukraine, mining region, post-industrial mining region called the Donbass, who had been a criminal in his previous life, who had various convictions, and basically was a gangster close to the Kremlin. And Viktor Yushchenko, who seemed to be the forward-looking, Western-looking, my wife speaks English, maybe we could integrate into Europe candidate. And that was a very nasty election. Yanukovych's team tried to poison Yushchenko with dioxin and did poison Yushchenko with dioxin, and his kind of grotesquely disfigured face became the symbol of that very dirty politics. And then they cheated in the election and declared victory. At that point, Ukrainians went out into the street. In particular, they went out to this big square in the center of Kiev called the Maidan. For those of you who haven't been to Kiev, which is probably most of you, the thing to know about the Maidan is that as city squares go, it's particularly big and it's a particularly complex geographical space. It's kind of multi-layers. There's like a subway and a mall underneath. There's some very tall monuments. It's not like just a kind of quadratic square. You can look it up afterwards. But anyway, there are many possibilities with such a space, both just in terms of how large it is and in terms of the different levels and different layers of it. So Ukrainians in November 2004, they went out and they protested falsified elections, and their demand was to have free and fair elections. And they went out to the square, thousands of them, for 3 weeks in November 2004, and miraculously, without a shot being fired, they won. The elections were done over. This time, Yushchenko was declared a winner. Everybody was happy, and they went home. And the short version of that story, as you can probably guess, is that it wasn't happily ever after. After that, Yushchenko didn't turn out to be the messiah figure that had been hoped for. There's always a problem when you invest your hope that there's going to be some messiah figure. There was immediately or quickly infighting on his team. There was a falling out between him and his prime minister. And in the meantime, Viktor Yanukovych, who had been so thoroughly discredited, imagine you not only lose the election, but it's been exposed that you manipulated election results. I don't know how we'd relate to that in this country. It's been exposed that you manipulated election results and that you poisoned your opponent, like the gangster that you are. You would think he could never, ever come back. But somehow behind the scenes, he's still determined. And he hires this guy from Washington. It turns out that there's this guy in Washington who has a little boutique industry going for gangsters with presidential ambitions. Who knew? But that's a boutique industry. And so the guy with his boutique industry for the gangsters with presidential ambitions, who spoke neither Ukrainian nor Russian, but had lots of experience with similar types of people, flies over to Kiev and starts playing golf with Yanukovych and gets him a new haircut and teaches him some television tricks. That guy's name, by the way, was Paul Manafort. Some of you may have heard of him. He'll show up later in our story. Improbably enough, what seemed impossible happens due to the disappointment with Yushchenko. In 2010, Yanukovych comes back, this time legitimately to win the elections. In elections in which there are really no good choices, but he was still probably the worst of the bad choices that were available at the time. he comes back to win the elections in 2010. Among a lot of young people, among the intelligentsia, there's a sense of despondence, that they're kind of sinking into a hole. But this time, nobody contests the election results, and nobody I've talked to in Ukraine on any side of anything has suggested that the 2010 elections were unfair. This time, he does legitimately win the elections. Maybe I'll tell you as a short footnote. I have this problem deviating into footnotes. And in November 2016, on the Wednesday after the presidential elections, when I was lying on the floor of my office at Yale, throwing up into a plastic bag, the first person who called me was Slava Vakarchuk, the Ukrainian rock star. For those of you who've never heard him, you can Google him. There's lots of fantastic music on the internet. And he calls me, he's like, Marci, it's Slava. I'm calling from Kiev. And I just want to give you my moral support. And I think I actually know how you feel. And this was kind of how I felt in 2010 when I realized that we actually voted for Yanukovych, and maybe this is something that countries have to go through and societies have to go through in order to learn from their mistakes. As you probably know, there'll be a point at this story where Paul Manafort comes back across the ocean, and Frank Foyer, who is a journalist and editor who I had originally met in Kiev in 2014, wrote an article, I think in summer of 2016, saying, hey, you guys don't think Trump could win, you don't know Paul Manafort. And unfortunately, Frank was right. I read it and thought, God, I hope you're wrong, but he wasn't. In any case, so Yanukovych is now the president. There's a sense of stagnancy. It's clear that he and his cronies are just stealing the country's wealth and living in their palaces with their private zoos and pet ostriches and 25 cars, where in large parts of the country people barely have enough food and can't heat their homes, and there's a drastic division of wealth. But still, there was a sense that despite the closeness of the Kremlin, despite the fact that Yanukovych was so unapologetically, openly a gangster, that he was nominally holding out as a compromise the fact that he was leading Ukraine onto a possible path of European Union membership, which for young people and for the intelligentsia was the lifeline. Was Europe going to be open to us? After long negotiations, in November 2013, there was an association agreement prepared with the European Union. It was not a fantastic agreement. It would have entailed Ukraine's taking on very costly reforms. It obviously would have provoked retaliation by Putin and the Kremlin. And at the end of the day, it didn't promise that eventually the European Union would accept Ukraine as a member. But it was a foot in the door. It was a sign of hope. It was a sign that potentially, if everything goes well, Europe is ready to accept us. And especially for people like the age of the students in that room here, whether or not Europe was going to open to them was everything. Would you be able to travel without spending lots of money you didn't have and lots of time waiting in long lines and going through interviews and filling out forms and pleading for a visa? Would you be able to go abroad to learn foreign languages? Would you be able to do student exchanges? Would you be able to participate in the Erasmus program? Would you be able to do internships? Would you gain the skills you needed to work in a global world? For them, it was everything, whether or not Europe was going to be open to them. And it seemed that he was about to sign the agreement. The ceremony was all prepared. The pens were on the table in Vilnius. And then at the very last moment, November 21st, 2013, after some phone call with Putin, he said, no, I'm not going to sign it. And at that moment, there's this sense of devastation. But still, nothing might have happened. And this is an example of historical contingency, the way small actions can sometimes trigger large events. A 32-year-old Afghan-Ukrainian journalist named Mustafa Naim, actually my husband just met a few days ago in Kiev and sent me a picture. So this very young guy, a native speaker of Farsi from Afghanistan, who had then subsequently his family moved and he had grown up in Ukraine, published in Russian on Facebook a little note that night saying, hey guys, let's get serious. If you're really upset, come out to the Maidan by midnight tonight. And then he said, likes do not count. And that, as a historian, that fascinated me because that likes do not count, interestingly, it often got mistranslated into English, which is strange because it's one of the rare serendipitous moments when the Russian translates perfectly into English. It's literally likes do not count. And I thought, wow, that's a sentence that would have made no sense before Facebook. Likes do not count. And suddenly it's a revolutionary slogan for the 21st century because people came to the Maidan that night. Largely young people, mostly students, hundreds of them, a couple thousand of them. They were not interested in language politics. Ukraine is a bilingual country. They weren't interested in ethnic politics. They weren't interested in religious politics. They weren't interested in opposition political parties. Their slogan was, Ukraine is Europe. They wanted Europe open to them. They held hands, they danced, they made food, they froze, they stayed there for a few weeks, insisting Ukraine is Europe. They called themselves Euromaidan. And again, that may have kind of dissolved because it was getting colder and colder in Kiev as you moved into the winter. Had not some 10 days later, Yanukovych decided, whether under pressure from Putin or his cronies or by himself, that he was going to clamp down and end this thing. And he was going to send out his thugs, his secret police type called Berkut. In Russian, they just call these guys siloviki, these like men of strength. Basically you're like professional gangsters, you're like special police force to brutally beat up the students. And there are two things about this I want to point out. One is that there had been a tacit social contract. Despite the fact that Ukraine had been a kleptocratic oligarchy, that all the resources were being stolen from the people, that there was no rule of law, that everything was blackmail and corruption, that journalists who were in the opposition had been assassinated from time to time, there had been since 1991 no large-scale violence by the government towards its own population. And there was a tacit agreement that that did not happen and that would not happen, and that was a red line. So in violation of that agreement, Yanukovych sends his guys out, and the idea seems to be that these are almost all young people. They're almost all people student age. The parents are going to freak out and they're going to pull their kids off the streets. That was the gambit. And the extraordinary thing that happens that night, and he brutally comes out, like Berkut comes out at 4 a.m. They brutally beat up these students, enough to send a whole bunch of them to the hospital, but not actually kill any of them, although that's unclear in the beginning. Counting on the parents to pull the kids off the streets. And what happens is that instead of the parents pulling the kids off the streets, the parents join them there. So a day or so later, instead of 800 or 2,000 people of student age on the Maidan, you have close to 1 million people on the streets of Kiev. No one has ever seen that many people on the streets of Kiev. And now they're not just shouting, Ukraine is Europe. Now they're shouting, we will not permit you to beat our children. And that was when Euromaidan just becomes Maidan. And it's no longer just about the European Union, which is something that mattered much more to the intelligentsia, much more to a younger generation than it did to older people, than it did to workers, than it did to people who weren't going to travel anyway. Now you really have this kind of extraordinary mass involvement of people who otherwise had never had any connection to one another. As a historian, one of the things that captured me about this was that so many revolutions, and people who study revolutions will relate to this, can be imploded as Oedipal rebellions. Each generation in its turn rising up against the fathers. And here you have this almost kind of Hegelian Aufhebung of Oedipal rebellion, where suddenly you have multiple generations come out together. People are now going to the Maidan with their children, with their grandparents, multiple generations of the same family. And so one of the things I did when I was working on my book about the Maidan was I interviewed parents and children together about what that meant. And one of the fathers and sons pairs I interviewed was Roman and Taras Ratushny. And Roman at that time was only 16 years old. He was one of the students who was beaten up and seriously injured that night. And he wasn't even university age yet. He was high school age. He was living with his mother, and I said, your mother must have been very upset, but she let you go back. And he said, my mother was making Molotov cocktails on Hrushevskaya Street. Over the next few months, what happened was, even watching from a distance, the most extraordinary thing I had seen in all my years of hanging out in Eastern Europe. It was the first time I had kind of seen a revolution in real time. That was not just a political transformation, but an existential transformation. People changed. Human beings changed. It was no longer just about Europe. It was an impassioned revolt against something that in Russian is called proizvol. And proizvol, which is a word we don't quite have in English, but I tried to explain during the Trump administration. It was clearly a word that we needed because we had the phenomenon. We just didn't have the word. It means arbitrariness tinged with tyranny, a sense that you are being treated as an object and not as a subject, as a plaything that the powers that be can do whatever they want with you. And this revolt against proizvol, was an insistence on being treated as a subject and not an object, as a human being and not a thing. It was a revolt on behalf of human dignity in the Kantian sense. And Europe, when people kept talking about Europe, was now no longer just the highly imperfect empirical instantiation of the European Union as an institution and as an organization and as a political structure. Now Europe was a kind of platonic essence of Europeness, and Europe meant, above all, the rule of law, human dignity, and human rights. That was what was Europe in the kind of ideal as opposed to real sense that was at stake there. The self-organization was incredible. I mean, it turns out there were all these little nascent kind of infrastructural things that were kind of bubbling beneath the surface, and then they suddenly exploded. Because within 48, 72 hours after the students were beaten up, you have mass kitchens operating on the Maidan. You have people cooking soup in cauldrons. You have people making tea. You have people distributing clothing. There's there's a piano. There's an open library. There are film screenings. There's an open university with lectures. There are medical clinics set up. There are masses of volunteers. You get a whole parallel society on the Maidan. It's a whole parallel world. It's not just a protest. It's actually a parallel world in which people are living according to the ideals they are espousing. As a moment of self-organization, it was amazing. I mean, so in the meantime, the regime is getting more and more brutal. They're kidnapping people. Their tortured bodies are being found frozen in the woods. People get injured. They're being kidnapped by Yanukovych's police force from the hospitals. People start organizing to keep guard at the hospitals. There is an SOS line set up for when people are taken, so that people can start looking for them sooner rather than later. I was in Vienna at the time. My friend Katya was shuttling back and forth between Kiev and Vienna. And I was like, Katya, how did you guys get an SOS line set up overnight like this? And she said, oh, well, there was there's an LGBT organization that had a confidential hotline where people could, call and kind of talk through these issues. And so they already had the hotline, so they donated it to the Maidan. And I thought that was an interesting detail because it shows that even these small scale efforts at self-organization that might have served small numbers of people then become a basis on which something can explode. The other thing that was remarkable to watch was the overcoming of boundaries. People who never in their lives would have encountered one another, had suddenly showed up there. And I was in a strange situation. I was an American watching from Vienna. I was at a research institute with a lot of Ukrainian colleagues who were shuttling back and forth. But I was also, to a large extent, seeing it through Polish eyes, because the Polish press coverage was so much better than the English or the German press coverage, and it's the coverage I was close to. My Ukrainian is only passive, and I was following it above all in Polish. And my friends who were older than I, who went through solidarity in Poland, who sat in prison under the communist period, they understood from the beginning what was going on. And I'll tell you a brief anecdote from a film that you should then all see, hopefully after this is over. So there's a fantastic film by Andrzej Wajda called Man of Iron, which is the second one in the series. The first is Man in Marble, set in the Stalinist period. The second is Man of Iron. And one of the things it tells the story of is that in 1968, there were student protests against the communist regime. And it's a fictional film, but it's based on real events. And in the film, a student goes to his father, who is a shipyard worker, while the students are being beaten up and imprisoned, and asks his father to bring out the workers on behalf of the students in solidarity. And the father locks the son in his room. He refuses, and he says, when the time is right, we will march together. And the son is livid. The son says, I will never forgive you. We will never march together. You let us down. And 2 years later, it's the workers who come out to protest the regime, and the father then goes to his son and asks him to bring out the students. And the son says, hey, you let us down 2 years ago, now you go to hell. And the miracle that was solidarity in Poland was the coming together, not just of the workers and the intellectuals, and the Catholics and the Jews, and the Christians and the Marxists, but also the fathers and the sons. And for everybody who experienced solidarity, who I know in Poland, the overcoming of all those divisions, that they understood that it is something that is fragile, that is ephemeral, that has never in human history lasted, but they also know that it is something extraordinarily precious and miraculous that they never counted on living to see a second time in their lifetime. And they understood when they saw it in Ukraine. And that was an extraordinary thing to see. I mean, when I went to Kiev in spring of 2014, and I saw some of my older friends from Poland from Solidarity, they're like my friend Costello, who I've known for 20 some years. I like to think he's always happy to see me. He picked me up and twirled me around. There was a sense of something ecstatic having occurred, not because they were so idealistic, but because they understood that this revelation of a human capacity for solidarity is something we see rarely, but the fact that it can happen even for a flicker of a second, is a reminder that that possibility exists, and then we have it in us. Okay, so this story ends, or it doesn't end, but it goes through a turning point. The tension builds all winter. People stay on the Maidan. They live there. They walk through the night. It becomes more and more elaborate, and the violence gets more and more grotesque. And you can feel it building. And at a certain moment, even from a distance, you could feel a kind of existential shift. In November, nobody was thinking they were going to die there. By the second half of January, you could feel it almost tangibly that a critical mass of people had made an existential decision and they were willing to die there if need be. And you knew just watching the live stream come through that at some point the violence was going to come down in mass and that they were not going to leave, that decision had already been made. It ends with a massacre. It ends with a massacre in February 2014. Yanukovych, in the end, having had his snipers massacre some 100 people, then flees across the border into Russia. Paul Manafort is out of a job, and we all know what he does next. Putin exploits the opportunity to send his so-called little green men, so guys in unmarked camouflage, to the Crimean Peninsula to just kind of take it over. And he sends so-called Russian tourists across the border to instigate armed rebellions against Ukrainian rule at a moment when basically Ukraine has no government. because they've just overthrown the president. The president has fled, and they haven't really put a new government in place. So these in spring and late February and March of 2014, you didn't know whether a war was going to start, where it was going to start. Was it going to be Odessa? Was it going to be Kharkiv? Was it going to be in the Donbass? I mean, was it going to reach Kiev? Nobody knew. And it seemed like anything could happen because there really was nothing in place. In the end, Putin manages to instigate a so-called separatist rebellion in the Donbass, in this far eastern mining region, in part due to the work of a troll factory in St. Petersburg that disseminates a story that the revolution on the Maidan was a CIA-sponsored Ukrainian fascist conspiracy, and far right-wing Ukrainian nationalists were coming east to massacre all the native Russian speakers. And the thing to know about this is that Ukraine is a bilingual country. People speak Russian and Ukrainian. The relationship between Russian and Ukrainian is kind of like the relationship between, say, Spanish and Italian. So two distinct languages, but they're related. If you're a native Spanish speaker, you could learn Italian pretty quickly. If you're a native Spanish speaker who's lived in Italy for a while, you probably have passive Italian. In general, as you move west, Ukrainian is more dominant. In general, as you move east, Russian is more dominant, but that kind of obscures the fact that it's really bilingual and most people can switch. But this is where you're playing on the fears of people of, okay, that there was a CIA conspiracy, there was an overthrow, a coup in Kiev, and now people are coming to murder you. This was a story disseminated by this troll factory in St. Petersburg. Turns out the very same troll factory who disseminates that Hillary Clinton is kidnapping children and stashing them in the basement of a pizza place in Washington, throwing spaghetti essentially like against the wall. You see what sticks. It could work anywhere in the world. What happens in the Donbass is somewhat grotesque. You have this, it's very kind of confusing in the beginning, like war breaks out. There are these separatists taking over like their own little fiefdom here and there. People don't really know exactly who they are in the beginning. Are they local people? Are they local Russians? Are they Kremlin agents? Are they like soccer fans who have been bought? Some of them are kind of mercenaries. Some of them are paid thugs. Nobody really knows for sure. My friend Katya, who ends up fleeing from Donetsk, but she was a student there, and she's trying to like tell me systematically about like the different groups of people who are participating in this kind of crazy violent takeover. And she's like, Marci, and then one day the Chechens came. And they didn't even speak Russian very well, and they didn't understand why they were getting Ukrainian currency instead of Russian currency from the bank machine, And then one day they called this meeting on Lenin Square, and this like elderly, Russian Orthodox, grandmother comes out on Lenin Square, and she gives an Orthodox christening to the leading Chechen soldier so that he'll be victorious in battle against the Ukrainian Nazis. And Katya, who's from the Donbass, who's like, she's maybe 25 at the time, she's tearing her hair out. We're sitting at this like little tea place in Kiev later, a couple months later, and she's telling me the story. She's like, Marci, everything in this story is fiction. You have the Christian woman on the communist square giving an Orthodox christening to a Muslim soldier so that he can go kill non-existent Ukrainian Nazis. Everything is fiction, and it's all really happening. That war has now kind of lingered, simmered for 8 years. It took, before the past 6 months, it took some 15,000 lives and sent about close to 2 million internal refugees into other parts of Ukraine. So there's this category of internally displaced persons in which you essentially become a refugee in your own country. In the meantime, Ukraine was in no state to fight a war. The army was being crowdfunded on the internet. When I was in Dnipropetrovsk, which is now Dnipro, a city in the east close to the front, in 2015, it was civil society doing prisoner exchanges. It was all from below. It was all grassroots organization because the state was essentially not functioning. Um, okay. Um, I had this historian's kind of fear very early on that the Donbass, this far eastern Ukrainian mining region, there are some now great novels about it that have been translated into English that you could read to commune with the Donbass. This place that no one has been to and nobody knows anything about, and was like the most post-Soviet part of Ukraine, that was going to be the equivalent of the Sudetenland. If for those of you who remember how the Second World War gets started, Hitler is coming to power. You know, he comes to power in 1933, 1938. There's a conference in Munich. Hitler wants this strip of Czechoslovakia along the western edge, which is inhabited largely by ethnic Germans. And, you know, he is saying to the British, to the French, if you just give me this part of Czechoslovakia, then I'll be happy and I won't declare war on the rest of you guys. Nobody from Czechoslovakia is actually invited to this conference, but most famously, or rather infamously, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain goes to Munich in September 1938 and decides to give Hitler what he wants. This is the infamous appeasement at Munich. And at that time, during that conference, Neville Chamberlain gives a statement in which he tells the British people how horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. And I thought, wow, the Donbass is that quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. And you could feel it already in 2014 that this could be the thing that triggers the Third World War. I mean, it was there. For anyone who was watching, it was there. Fast forward now 8 years later to February of this year, and Slava Varkarchuk, the same Ukrainian rock star, who I hope you'll all now listen to his music, he called me on, it must have been February 20th, so maybe four days before what turns out to be the invasion, and I was like, Slava, how does it feel in Kiev? And he said, well, Marci, imagine a fusion between how it must have felt to be in Florida in October 1961 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how it must have felt to be in Central Europe after the Munich Agreement. He's like, it feels something like a blend of those things. Now, the person who is now president of Ukraine at now and 6 months ago as well is somebody named Volodymyr Zelensky. The first person who was elected in the free elections that were held after the Maidan, his name was Petro Poroshenko, who was another oligarch and generally considered the best of the worst, somewhat banal, not particularly cruel, but also not fantastic. There was clearly kind of lacking a political class of people of non-oligarchs to run. Against Poroshenko in the April 2019 elections ran at the last minute a comedian in his 40s named Volodymyr Zelensky, who had been, this is so extremely postmodern, you wouldn't believe it, for those of you who haven't seen this. So Zelensky, who had won years ago Ukraine's Dancing with the Stars contest, so he's a performer, he's an actor, had a very popular post-Maidan serial television show called Servant of the People. It's now subtitled in English. You guys can all go to Netflix and watch it. It's actually very good, I think. And the conceit of this television show that he has after the Maidan is that in this country mired in corruption and an oligarchic political class, in which is all, no one even expects there could possibly be an end to corruption, this history teacher inadvertently ends up being elected president. And like kind of desperate to figure out like how to get the country out of oligarchy. He can't find anybody who's not already caught up in webs of corruption. So he like hires his old friends from high school who are great and good and loyal to him, but don't really have any political experience. And it's political satire. And if you can kind of imagine, the students are probably too young. You're probably too young to remember Trevor Noah's predecessor on The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, who was a little bit edgier than Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah, who I love, is like, is a kind of deeply kind person in a lot of ways. I mean, Jon Stewart was well, but if you can imagine like a blend of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and Seinfeld, this is like Zelensky's servant of the people. And in a bizarre effacing of the boundary between television and reality, the actor who is playing the history teacher who inadvertently gets elected president becomes the actor who kind of inadvertently gets elected president. He comes out of nowhere and he wins elections with 73% of the vote, which is just like kind of unheard of. He's a comedian with no political experience. He's a native Russian speaker. He's a Jew, which is a whole other issue. I was an agnostic about Zelensky. I had no particularly strong feelings about him. I felt like the verdict is still out. I don't know anything. Some people were critical. Some people were hopeful. It seemed to be that anything could be possible. The moment that caught me about Zelensky was February 23rd of this year, when Russian forces were poised around the border. Nobody knew if Putin was actually going to invade or not. And Zelensky Putin had just given this grotesque speech, on February 21st, in which he seemed clearly deranged, in which he's like, oh, okay, Ukrainians, you want decommunization, I'll show you decommunization. He seemed like a total lunatic. And Zelensky then gave a speech, an address to ordinary Russian people on the evening of February 23rd, in which he said, I'm not addressing the Kremlin, I'm addressing ordinary Russians, and I am asking you, please don't do this. Please don't come here and kill us. Many of us have friends and relatives and family members on the other side of the border, which wasn't a border 30 years ago. This isn't the relationship we want to have with you. There's no reason we want to fight you. If you come here and try to kill us, well, we will defend ourselves. And his line that becomes famous, he's like, you will not see our backs, you'll see our faces, we will look you in the eye. But this is not what we want. Please don't do this. And it was extraordinary. I mean, it was one of the best addresses to anyone. It was so real, it was so human, and it was so intimate. And it was intimate in a way that only a native speaker speaking to other native speakers could have done that. And like that, the part of Zelensky who had a whole life in Russia, and in Russian, which was his native language, you could feel the realness there. And then just hours later, the invasion came. And there were 3 times in my life where I have really been paralyzed by world historical events in which I felt like something so horrible happened I couldn't move. One was being in New York on September 11th, and the other was the night that Trump was elected, and the third was February 24th. One of the things I promise I'm going to stop talking momentarily. One of the things that was notable about that was that, Putin sends in this like long line of tanks into Kiev, which I knew nothing about military anything. Now people have tried to tutor me, so I know only slightly more than nothing. In a way that suggested that he was absolutely sure that Ukraine was going to fall in 3 days, and that his army was going to be welcomed with open arms in Kiev, and they would be having victory parades. Now, I know nothing about military anything. Anyone who has ever been to Kiev could have told you there was no chance that the Russian army was going to be welcomed with open arms in Kiev. It's like, imagine that like January 6th had gone the other way and Trump had gotten an army together and suddenly showed up and started shelling Toronto and saying, hey, you guys speak English, we speak English, you eat hamburgers and french fries, we eat hamburgers and french fries. Surely you're happy to become part of our great empire. I mean, would people in Toronto be pleased, even if lots of them have cousins in Philly? Like, no. I mean, this like no one how could you possibly think that? I mean, you couldn't possibly have intelligence so bad. They sent in teams of assassins to assassinate Zelensky. The American military offered to evacuate Zelensky. And that's where the critical moment of existential decision making came. People are like, this guy's a comedian. No, Ukraine is in no shape to do this. They don't have a chance. How do you get someone with no political experience to be a wartime president? The Americans say, we'll get you out of here. Zelensky goes out in a t-shirt with a few of the guys from his administration on the streets in Kiev at night, like in front of everyone, takes out his cell phone, films a selfie, and says, I, the president, am here. We are all here. We are not leaving. And it was like this, like, ja, president tut. I, the president, am here. Like that became one of those moments that kind of changes the world because he decided to stay. What's happened afterwards has been, grotesque. I mean, essentially, there's been a campaign of moral blackmail. The Russian army came in and started bombing maternity hospitals, bombing kindergartens, bombing residential buildings, with the blackmail being that if the army doesn't surrender, we will kill the women and children. And the best response to that, I think, was written by my friend Natalia Gumanyuk, who's an extraordinarily fearless journalist. And she wrote a piece, it was either in Rolling Stone or Washington Post, I can't remember, earlier in the war, why the moral blackmail won't work. And she said, by conducting a reign of terror, all you do is show Ukrainians what will happen to us if we surrender to you. If you come into town and start arbitrarily kidnapping, torturing, and murdering people, nobody's going to feel like this will stop if we surrender because you've just shown yourself to carry out a reign of terror. This has been, in some sense, Putin's whole advantage, that like he has no constraints. There's no limits to the possible for him. Anything is possible. And that's one of the things that, if other people's lives mean nothing to you, and I think the lives of Russian soldiers also mean nothing to him. If other people's lives mean nothing to you, then you have a free hand. Then anything is possible. Then there's no constraint. On June 9th, I got news that Roman Ratushny, the young man who was 16 at the time, who said his mother was making Molotov cocktails on Hrushevskaya Street, he was killed on the front lines near Izum. And just this past weekend, when in fact my husband was in Kiev meeting with Zelensky, we got the news that Izum had just been liberated, and they're going to name a street in Kiev after Roman Ratushny, the young man who hadn't even turned 25, who I had interviewed for my book. Okay. I know I'm talking too long, so I'm gonna end this and show you a cheerful video. There are many things that have been extraordinary. One of which is the role of Jewish-Ukrainian relations are a whole other thing, and there's a very dark history. The idea that a Russian-speaking Jewish comedian accused of being a Ukrainian Nazi has stepped into the role of Winston Churchill, is a kind of like, they're just level upon layer of historical irony there. Nobody could have imagined this. One thing I found myself saying to journalists is that, like, if we ever needed more proof that there is no end of history, we have it now. There is no such thing as the end of history. History goes on, filled with nothing but surprises. Okay, I want to end on a cheerful note. And I want to also end. I of course didn't know the person we're honoring today. I didn't know Brother Costello, and I'm an agnostic Jew. I'm not a Christian, but this has been a moment where there's been a lot of talk about faith. And I knew nothing about military anything. In the beginning of the war, everyone was saying Ukraine has absolutely no chance. They're going to fall in 3 days. Even not welcoming anyone, they're going to fall in 3 days. They don't have the people. They don't have the weapons. And in those initial days, I was texting with my friend Yurko Prohasko, who's also one of the protagonists of my book. If you read the book, you can read all about Yurko, who is a literary translator and a psychoanalyst in Lviv. We speak in Polish. This is my translation. And I was texting with him. The war broke out, and he had refugees who had fled. Lviv is a city in the west, who had fled from the east. And I said, Yurko, is there anything else we can do? And at the beginning, he was like, you guys are doing everything you can. You're giving lectures, you're writing, you're giving interviews, you're trying to explain to people what's going on. I'm like, Yurko, is there anything else? Is there anything else I can do? And he wrote back and he said wierzyć, which in Polish is like, he's like, believe. It's like, you can believe. Don't stop believing. And I promised him, and because I promised him, that has actually inflected. Like I said, okay, I promised, I'm not going to give up. And now it looks like there's actually a chance. I want to leave you with something that I like to show my students. This is a video that was filmed in Odessa, a city in the southeast that has been shelled but not occupied, but that Putin very much wants. There was a fantastic article by Roger Cohen, I think last week or 2 weeks ago in the New York Times about Odessa. Right at the beginning of the war in the Donbass, it was March 2014. It was after the massacre in the Maidan, when the separatist rebellion is just beginning, when those little green men have showed up on the Crimean Peninsula. And this is a big market, and in particular, a fish market in Odessa. And I love this video because it is a sign of hope in times of darkness. So I'm gonna end by showing this to you if I can figure out how to work this. My very primitive computer skills. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shore. As a child who spent a lot of time in malls playing the Ode to Joy, like that really struck home. Um, um, we'd love it if you would answer some questions for us. We're going to do things a little bit differently this year because we have the corded mics. So we need people to come up to that microphone once I figure out how to turn it on. And our tradition is always to begin and end with a student. So it might make sense to form a line, but always beginning with a student. Don't be shy. What an opportunity. So this is live now.
Why do you think that after, I forgot his name, but the president of Ukraine at the time, after he ordered the massacre, why did he flee the country after?
That's a very good question. So how this ended, and it was, so this was February, it was February 2014, which feels to me like 2 weeks ago, but it was 8 years ago, so you were probably a child then and feels much further away from you. But one of the things that struck me was that this was all being live streamed, and the people on the Maidan had actually set up cameras to live stream themselves. You know, which also raises a very interesting question, because the government at the time controlled the official media. So in order to get your story out, you needed to go to social media and to alternative methods, you know, and so they turned the cameras on themselves. So there is a sense of which is total violation of your own privacy became the precondition for asserting your own subjectivity. And this became in February during this massacre, like we're all actually watching this being live streamed on YouTube, you know, as people are being slaughtered in front of us, which now continues to be a theme. You know, journalists keep asking me, they're like, how is this different from the Second World War? And I'm like, internet. Like, imagine you had a live stream into the gas chambers. Like, we're watching it all, you know, in real time. So we're watching this happening. And the person who played a critical role was the then foreign minister of Poland, Radoslaw Sikorski, who was on a skiing vacation at that time from his family, and decided that he was going to go to Kiev and try to negotiate a ceasefire. And he takes his French and German colleagues with him, but it's really Radek who does the negotiating. And I was fascinated by this because one, like I'm watching the live feed come in on the Polish press, and Radek is tweeting like, I'm on my way to Kiev. I'm going to try to talk to Yanukovych. And there's a massacre going on, and the presidential palace is maybe a quarter mile. I mean, maybe 200. I don't know, 200 meters from the Maidan. I mean, it's basically right around the corner, and you can kind of smell the smoke. Things are burning, and you go in, and you're talking to someone who doesn't care that these people are being killed there. And you know that with every additional 5 minutes you spend talking to him, more people are being killed. And Radek is not stupid. He's older than I am. He came of age in Solidarity Poland. He knows exactly who he's dealing with. He doesn't have any illusions about Yanukovych's, goodwill or anything. And I was like, Radek afterwards, I was like, Radek, did he feel anything about the fact that these people are being killed? And Radek is like, Yanukovych, and Radek is like, Marci, he's not that bright. He doesn't have much of an emotional imagination. No, he didn't care at all. But at a certain point, there was a ceasefire agreement made. And according to that agreement, Yanukovych was going to hold early elections at the end of the year. So he was going to remain as president decisively for several months, and then there'd be early elections. Now, no one from the Maidan wanted to agree to this, even though they didn't have the weapons, even though they were being massacred. And Radek goes to the leaders of the Maidan in a clip that you can find on YouTube, and he's like, listen, I came of age in Poland during Solidarity. I remember December 1981 and martial law. We overestimated our strength and underestimated the regime's strength then. If you don't sign this now, you're going to get the army, you're going to get martial law, you'll all be dead. He's like, you sign it now and later you ask for more. And that worked, and they signed it. But there was a sense of, that they're carrying the coffins of their people. And there was this young guy who had been also fighting with his father in a unit, who gets up on the stage in the Maidan and says, no, no Yanukovych, not for another 6 months, not for another 6 days. And the mood is such that before you knew it, you turn around and Yanukovych has fled the country. And he's obviously not that brave. What would have happened had he not fled is unclear. But there was a sense that while there was a ceasefire brokered, it was also the case, and this is something I was really, really thinking about in the summer of 2020 with the violence against the Black Lives Matter protesters in Oregon and the little green American men who were in unmarked camouflage coming out, that his own security apparatus was starting to defect. So at first, there was a unit in Lviv of the Berkut guys who were called up to reinforce the people in Kiev, and one unit says, no, we're not going to go. And then the next unit says, no, we're not going to go. And I was watching it come through on the feed, and the Poles were using the expression crossed over to the side of the people, but basically various segments of the police, the special police, the militia were starting to change sides. And at a certain point, you reach a tipping point. And that's how revolutions happen. And you never really know what that tipping point's going to be. You never know what's going to be the thing that kind of pushes it over. But he knew he was losing support. And he's clearly not a very brave person. And he flees across the border to Russia. And Putin shelters him. And that's when Paul Manafort is out of a job.
Hello. Is this okay? So you talked a lot about the end of history and kind of how that's very much been disproven. And I know it's not exactly our business to predict the future, but what is your hope for Ukraine beyond just peace?
Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah, I know historians are always like, best case scenario, we can tell you what already happened. We can never tell you what's actually going to happen. my hopes are, one, I don't think it really ends until Putin's regime falls. I'm not one of the people who thinks that, well, if you go back to these borders, if you go back to those borders. I think the situation in Russia is such that I think it's a kind of Nazi Germany type of situation. I think it doesn't come to an end, until the regime collapses. Now, when and how that happens is kind of anyone's guess. My historian's perspective will say that it will seem absolutely impossible until it happens, and then it will seem inevitable. You never know what's going to be like the stone that starts the avalanche or the domino effect. Um, my my hope for Ukraine, in some sense, is my hope for all of us. Can we create a world, in which we live in the Kantian sense, with governments that respect human dignity, with governments that respect human rights? Like, can we? People say like, well, can Ukraine become a normal country? Well, the thing about normal is like, is anyone really normal? Like normal like us? Well, there are lots of very dark things that happen in this country as well. Normal like, as we think we should be and have never actually been, but maybe in some kind of ideal sense, like there is a hope or a striving for. Um, I would like to see Ukraine retain the kind of cosmopolitanism that has exploded, at this moment. I mean, one of the things about Ukrainian identity is that it's something that has come into being in a very different way in the past 8 years than it had been before. And in a very different way in the past 30 years than it had been before. My friend Yaroslav Hertzak is, when he's been talking to American audiences on Zoom, he's like, you have to understand the critical difference between Russian and Ukrainians is not an ethnic difference, because ethnically it's very similar. It's not a linguistic difference because, yes, we also speak English and the languages are not so dissimilar. It's a difference in political culture. It's about, are we going to think of ourselves as objects? Or are we going to think of ourselves as subjects? And the big question, in some sense, is not what has gone right in Ukraine as Ukraine has kind of come of age, but what has gone wrong in Russia. Like, I'm looking at like these Russian soldiers who are carrying out mass atrocity, and you're like, why? They have no reason. There's no reason. I mean, you're just slaughtering people for no reason. Like, and you're trying to figure out like what's in their head. Well, they've been told that there's, a Nazi fascist government in Kiev and that they are there to liberate their Russian speaking brothers. But they get there and, Russian speakers, their grandparents' age, come out in the streets in front of their tanks and shout at them in Russian and say, nobody wants you here, go home. So what are they really thinking? Like, what's inside their head? And why are they just following orders? And I think that's the question. I mean, I think in some sense you need a reset. And I think that, I think in some sense the story is true that like as long as there are people in power who care nothing for other people's lives anywhere, nobody's really safe anywhere.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So you mentioned earlier the importance of social media during the revolution. Do you think that was key for the success of the revolution? And how do you think it would have played out differently in a pre-social media era?
It's a great question. I think it would have been impossible before social media, just in a practical sense. I mean, this is one question, historians ask a lot too about the communist period. Like, what would have happened? It was much easier to monopolize the information space pre-social media. It was much, I mean, when the people I write about when I'm not talking about the president, the intellectuals and the philosophers who were dissidents during the communist period, like it was illegal to have, a copy machine, to have newsprint. Like, it wasn't that easy to do underground publishing to kind of get your message out. I mean, social media created a situation that made it practically impossible for the government to monopolize channels of communication. And to all of these internet savvy young people, this was huge in Belarus too, 2 years ago. All the organizing, it was suddenly like independent telegram channels. You know, the government was cutting off this, the government was cutting off that. And then you've got your like precociously smart, 19-year-old, who like figures out how to get around the censorship and set up something on the internet. So it was all like, I mean, I had never been on Facebook that much before the Ukrainian Revolution. And suddenly stuff was just pouring in. And people were telling their stories. And suddenly you saw this phrase keep coming up like, please repost, please repost as much as possible. And the fact that those narratives were out there, both in terms of organizing, because it also made it possible, like somebody gets kidnapped or like somebody spots, a van full of the Berkut guys heading in a certain direction, to commit some act of violence, and suddenly they're texting someone who's texting someone, or they're posting something, so you have like these grandparents who you never thought of, like the type of people who would be in the internet, who are like opening Facebook and they're saying, oh, okay, wait, these guys are going over here. These people have been injured. We can't take them to the hospital because the police are waiting at the hospital. Like suddenly you've got a private clinic set up, in somebody's like shoe store, or in somebody's apartment. So it made possible organizing in a way that hadn't been done before. And it made it possible for people to understand in other places. And it made possible for things to get translated very quickly. Like one thing my husband and I were doing at that time, and a lot of our friends were doing, was translating. I mean, suddenly you're like, okay, if you're in a room and you're like, wait, do we have a translator who can do this, who can bring this here? But if you post on Facebook, like, we need somebody to translate this into that language, suddenly you're sent it out to the whole world. And so you can get someone in seconds.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Good evening. I had a question about earlier. You said Yanukovych, he was able to have Ukraine join the European Union, but he stopped that from happening. Is that offer still on the table from the European Union, or did they take that offer back? And another question is, if they were to join the European Union now, in what ways would that really help them in the current situation that they're in?
It's a great question. Well, one, that the offer was not a joining offer. It was an association agreement. So it wasn't fantastic. It was a kind of preliminary, there's a little bit of a trial kind of going on. Why it was so symbolically significant was the sense that it opened the possibility of joining Europe. And I think for many people, Europe wasn't the opposite of Asia. Europe was the opposite of communism. And Europe was in many ways very much idealized, but also this idea of being part of a world where human rights were respected, which again is one of those things that is true more in theory than in practice, like all sorts of imperfect institutions. But there was that sense of it, and that process went forward again under Poroshenko. And now there's actually been the papers submitted during the war for actual membership in the EU, which would be much more significant. And the question of how that's going to happen, or when that's going to happen, or will the EU let them in, is still. And also the relationship between the EU as the European Union and NATO as a defensive alliance, and what that would mean. I mean, one of the saddest things that I read on the eve of the war was Anne Applebaum wrote a piece for The Atlantic, and she was at the Munich Security Conference days before Russia invaded. And I still had no idea. I mean, I was watching. I thought maybe yes, maybe no. Who knows what's going on in Putin's head? And Anne was there in Munich, listening to the Russians. And she wrote this piece for The Atlantic and saying, everyone is on Ukraine's side, but in the end, Ukraine is going to fight alone. Nobody else is going to fight with them. And so to join the European Union, to join NATO would be like, we're no longer going to be alone.
Sorry, I have another question. So why can't people start fighting Russia? Because it doesn't just seem like it's affecting Ukraine. Like they seem like they're affecting things on a larger scale. Is it because they're not associated with like the European Union, or like why can't people start fighting Russia?
Like why can't other countries come in?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of the $1,000,000 question. Well, first of all, it's been remarkable that Ukraine has gotten as much aid as it has, which has basically been weapons, people sending weapons. The fear is of starting the Third World War. The fear is that, once we send troops, like if Americans send troops, if the European Union send troops, then we are at war with Russia. And the fear is of nuclear war. And Putin keeps hinting that he may use his nuclear weapons. Now, some people think that's a credible threat. Some people think that's not a credible threat. It's all based on kind of speculation about what would happen if. This is all kind of new. I mean, the moment when I found myself talking to politicians, from Washington, saying that like we must send lethal weapons to Ukraine immediately, I just thought I never in my life would have thought I'd be in that position. I've never even let my kids have a squirt gun. Like when my son begged and pleaded for a Nerf gun for his 9th birthday, I absolutely refused. I said, like, no weapons, no quasi weapons, no toy weapons. Like, I've considered myself a pacifist. My husband's a Quaker. He comes from a pacifist tradition. And we're both like, must send lethal weapons immediately to the Ukrainians, which is just a situation we never, ever thought we would be in. I mean, certainly, like, if you let the Poles fight too, I mean, I think it would be over very quickly, and the Ukrainians need more people. They think they can do it with the people they have if they just have more weapons. Again, like, I don't, I'm not in a situation to judge, but what has happened in the past, like, 72 hours has been so extraordinary that it seems that they might pull it off, or now I feel like they're actually going to pull it off. I've learned a little bit about some of the weapons. Some of my former students who are career military officers were like, one of them was like, Marci, okay, I made you a little cheat sheet. So I've written out all the different kinds of weapons along with a little Cliff Notes version, of what they do and why they're significant. And one of the things that apparently the Ukrainians have been doing very well is like they've got some really, really smart people doing strategy. Apparently much smarter than the people doing strategy for the Russians. I mean, some of them I trained, like, not to do military strategy, but like some of the former, like, or would-be graduate students and students I worked with, and people I taught philosophy to, at summer schools, or people whose dissertations I advised, or people who consulted with me on archival sources, people who are working on academic articles, like, have now been mobilized as the young intelligentsia to do military strategy. They're super smart. The fact that they read Kant with me, is that helping them? I don't know. I like to think it's doing something. But they're thinking really well, and the Russians don't seem to be thinking much at all. I mean, some of that seems to be the classical problem with dictatorship, that like the more you consolidate power as a dictator, that the more the people under you are afraid to tell you anything you don't want to hear. And so your information becomes more and more distorted because people only want to say things to flatter you. Because I'm just like, how could Putin think you're going to send in tanks to Kiev and people in Kiev are going to be happy to see them? No one who spent 30 seconds in Kiev could possibly think that. But apparently Putin's like, over the years, nobody wants to say anything except like, oh yes, everybody worships you, dear emperor. So perhaps the sentiment that perhaps they might actually win is the right way to end. And not only did we begin and end with students, we had all student questions. So much praise to all of you. Thank you so much, Dr. Shore.